everybody, Remi Sovran here from RemiSovran.com. In today's video, I want to talk about what the difference is between a standard traditional push-up versus a neutral grip wrist position push-up versus the perfect push-up. And so you might be asking, why is it important to understand the differences and why is it important to understand the implications? Well, I can tell you as a performance coach and a strength and conditioning coach, it's very important to understand these differences because when you're prescribing exercises to certain individuals or athletes, some various positions, whether it's their hand positions, elbow positions, or shoulder positions, could have various implications on various joints, tendons, ligaments, or even muscles. So depending on what the goal of the athlete is or the individual, we want to prescribe various exercises that are optimal for them. So if you take my case, for instance, I specifically work with high performance athletes that are in hockey and basketball. So those are I'm most familiar with. So when I look at those two sports, hockey and basketball, they're constantly using their wrists, whether that's stick handling, whether that's shooting, or just passing, or even receiving a pass. Whatever it may be, they're always using their wrists. So you got to think about it. They're always putting stress on their wrists, their ligaments, tendons, and their wrist joint. So at the same time, when I go to prescribe an exercise, so if I were to prescribe a push-up, just a standard push-up, if you think about it, when you get into that position of a standard push-up, as you can see, I'm just in a standard push-up position right now. My wrists are an extension, and they're staying in that position while I'm doing the push-up. So by being in that constant wrist extension position and performing the push-up and by lowering my body down to the ground and then pushing off the ground, I'm putting a lot of stress onto the wrist. So putting a lot of stress on those tendons, ligaments, and joints. And this wouldn't be practical to athletes or high-performance athletes involved in hockey or basketball. Because what could end up happening is if I constantly have them do push-ups in that position, and then when they go to play hockey or basketball, they could be more susceptible or prone to an injury just because there's a lot more stress that's being put on those joints, and there may be a risk for an overuse type injury. Not something that's practical or ideal, specifically considering when these athletes are not getting paid to do push-ups. They're getting paid to perform on the court or on the ice. And so if they get injured, whether it's in the gym, or whether it's on the ice or on the court, ultimately, it doesn't look good on the player or the coach, and it's going to ultimately affect their career. So, one of my goals as a coach is to make sure exercise is as injury risk-free as possible, but at the same time, we're optimizing their performance, maintaining their strength, and developing core stability. So, we consider the push-up, it's a great exercise for developing upper body strength and also developing core stability as well. So, in order to kind of take that wrist extension out and make exercise a little bit more optimal, we can get into a more neutral grip stance. So you could do this with push-up handles, or you can use the perfect push-up, or even dumbbells if you have dumbbells that are present. So just by getting into a neutral stance, as you can see, my wrists are out of that extension position. So by being out of that extension position, less stress placed on the wrist, ultimately we're minimizing the amount of stress, and ultimately, you can potentially be minimizing the risk of injury when an athlete is on the court or they're playing hockey. Because ultimately, by always using their wrists during hockey and basketball, I'd rather have them put the stress on their joints while they're playing their sport as opposed to in the weight room. Because the majority of injuries to athletes or individuals, a lot of injuries happen in the gym, or they begin in the gym, and they just carry over onto the court or onto the ice. And that's something that I try to preach and teach to my athletes and to individuals that I work with, is to understand proper mechanics, proper form, and teach good technique, and ultimately develop optimal performance and strength for them with minimizing the risk of injury. So moving on now, so now that I've kind of clarified the whole wrist position, the same would apply to a perfect push-up when you're getting into that rotational force now. Now it's important to mention though, when doing the push-up, when comparing the standard push-up, so when you get back into that standard push-up position, so you're in that extension position, so your palms are upwards like this. So what ends up happening is when you change to a neutral grip, so if I put my palm downwards neutral, and then I rotate, so because I'm going into that neutral position when I'm gripping this, so I'm holding it like this. So what ends up happening is my whole forearm here rotates and allows me to engage in external rotation on the shoulder. So ultimately, by getting into that neutral position, not only are we sparing the wrists, but we're slightly sparing the shoulders a little bit more too, just because we're allowing for that external rotation to occur in the shoulder. So that's another benefit, as well as for the neutral position when you compare it to just a standard push-up. Now, I haven't really talked about the perfect push-up, and I want to get into that now, because the perfect push-up, in my opinion, is the most optimal in terms of reducing the risk of injury, just because of the rotational force. So what you can see is, when you're performing the perfect push-up, so getting into the push-up stance, as I go down, and then I push upwards, and then I go down again, and push upwards, I'm getting a more natural motion of the shoulder. So my shoulder is not really in a fixed position in terms of just flexion and extension when you can compare it to a standard position. There's that free range of motion in terms of that rotation, coming out externally and then moving inwardly. So by moving externally and moving inward, we're getting that free motion of the shoulder. The glenohumeral joint can move much easier. So by allowing the glenohumeral joint to move much easier, we're reducing the stress on the shoulder joint and making it more optimal in terms of reducing the risk of injury, but still getting those strength benefits as well from the exercise. So those are kind of the two important things those are a few important things that I wanted to mention regarding the perfect push-up. So when you compare the three, the standard push-up would be the least optimal. The neutral kind of grip position would be a good choice, but the most optimal, in my opinion, would be the perfect push-up, just because it allows for that rotational force and ultimately puts your body into a better postural position. And so there's actually a research study that was conducted comparing the perfect push-up to a standard push-up, and what they found was that there was less posterior deltoid activation within the perfect push-up as opposed to a standard push-up. So with there being less posterior deltoid activation, this potentially could mean that there's less stabilization required in that posture of going inwards and outwards by using a swivel, as opposed to just kind of being in that fixed flexion extension position of the shoulder. So less stability means less stress. So if there's less stability required in the shoulder, that would mean less stress would be ultimately placed on the shoulder. So guys, that's just kind of a few tips that I wanted to mention regarding a standard push-up versus a neutral grip push-up versus the perfect push-up. The last thing to keep in mind though regarding the neutral grip and the perfect push-up is that it can be a double-edged sword. So what I mean now, this is where we have to be careful. So because our hands are elevated now off the ground, as you can see our hands are elevated, what ends up happening is that when we go down, we can get greater depth. And so by getting greater depth, ultimately what we're doing now is we're making exercise not only more challenging, we're potentially recruiting more muscles, getting more muscle activation, but the problem is that when you go further down, if you look at my elbow and my shoulder, the elbow is coming behind me like this, so behind my midline. So by the elbow coming behind my midline, my shoulder rotates forward. So as my shoulder rotates forward like this, the glenohumeral joint rotates forward and starts putting a lot of stress onto the glenohumeral joint as we get deep down and as we lower ourselves down into that further depth position. So what I like to advise, specifically for people that may have previous shoulder injuries or high performance athletes, is to just come to neutral. So the elbow should just come to neutral or just slightly past neutral, no more than that. Because as we go further back, you start cranking on the shoulder, and when you start adding weight on, whether it's a chains on your back, a weighted vest, you're going to put a lot of stress on the shoulder joint, and within time, some sort of shoulder injury could arise over time. So the key is just come to neutral. So just coming to neutral and then up. Just about neutral or just slightly past neutral is what I like to advise, just to avoid cranking on the shoulder. So that's just the last important thing I want to mention, as it can be a double-edged sword, because although you're getting that greater depth, working the muscles more, you are putting more stress on the joint. So that's just something I wanted to mention as well. So ultimately guys, there's kind of the differences between a standard push-up, a neutral wrist grip position, and a perfect push-up. And those are some differences. some of my recommendations, I'm not saying just a standard push-up is bad. I mean, a lot of people perform them all the time and they have no issues. It's just when you're working with someone that's in a high performance athlete or someone like that, you're looking to reduce the risk of injury as much as possible. Alright, so that's just my advice to you guys. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them below. And if you want to see more videos that are similar to this, where I'm talking about various exercise positions and what are the most optimal positions to be in terms of reducing the risk of injury and still kind of improving your strength and muscular endurance, then be sure to leave a comment about what you want to see. And also, just be sure to subscribe to my channel, because I'll be coming out with videos that are similar to this in terms of how to optimize performance while reducing the risk of injury. Okay guys, so that's it for today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care.